And for us to just decide, oh, let's, you know, these people are our brothers and they should be part of us. What a horrible.
Even if they don't want to be.
Yeah.
Well, we'll kill them then.
They don't know that they're our brothers, but they are, and we're going to show them.
Yeah.
Because
This
we're
is
gonna kill them.
certainly bad twist of love thy neighbor. Yeah.
Okay. Looks like
And
we
that's the
lost
thing in Russia,
someone. Looks like
there's
Diane
so
dropped
many
off.
People that
Should
are
probably come
related
back.
to those
All
that are
right.
in Ukraine.
Okay, I want to invite everybody to come back. Our friends online are back. And we are recording on YouTube. So I gave you this question to kind of bat around a little bit and talk about. I'm sure you had lots of things to say because it's the kind of question that, you know, touches the ground. So how do you live with uncertainty? So what were some of the things that you discussed in your circles? Yeah, Jeff, and you have the.
Well, since I've got the microphone, I can start here. I'll speak for a group. We had a number of different views on our tolerance for information, which is one of the things. Information creates uncertainty. So Frank doesn't watch the TV news. He looks at the left-hand column of the Wall Street Journal, which has a summary of the news, and he figures that's what he needs to know. I like to watch all the news. I mean, I don't watch all the news, but I read all the news. I read 3 newspapers and everything else. And that's maybe too much. And we kind of from the, you overheard us talking, Christian, we came down to the Serenity Prayer, which Reinhold Niebuhr or somebody wrote, which says, help me accept or change the things I can change, accept the things I can't change, and the wisdom to know the difference. And the idea that we take out of that is let's, focus on the things that you can change. Don't focus on all the news of the world because much of it's bad.
Yeah, okay.
Frank, you want to pass this over to your lovely wife?
Oh, I'm not the good one. We did learn that we would one day love to be invited to our fellow students' wonderful place up in Grand Marais.
Well, we
And now
decided,
Linda's going to extend an invitation.
Yeah. So we decided that our whole lives are just uncertainty going from one day to the next, and that having the Bible beside us in bed if we're really wavering on something, or jumping immediately into prayer when we're really having problems. My issue is getting involved in other people's lives where I'm creating uncertainty by trying to get into their issues, whether a grandchild's going to get into a certain college or who's going to make this decision. And, so I'm kind of a fixer. So create my own uncertainty by getting into all these things where I don't really belong. But I think we were all pretty accepting of it, and we had our own methods of dealing with it, whether it be I back off and don't try to think about it if it's something that I absolutely cannot change. So going with the prayer.
We also felt that uncertainty is kind of a gift. And we were thinking of people who have no uncertainty in their life and how boring it is for them.
Yeah,
So
right.
it can lead to great creativity.
That's right. That's right. I think one of the things I'll try to point out here is that, and it's not a direct connection to uncertainty, but those kinds of settings can also provide interesting opportunities, right? And I think that's important for us to keep in perspective. Tom, while you're gathering that, let me just check online and see what folks might want to share. Anyone online want to share something?
Those short naps are great.
All right, I think no one online. So Tom, why don't you go ahead?
Just the thought that came to mind was the definition of disillusionment. And just that when you are disillusioned, a lot of times you're in that, because you've come to that place of uncertainty of what you thought was real, you've become disillusioned. But what is disillusionment is that your illusions are broken. And so now you're looking at things as they really are.
Yeah, hopefully more clearly, right?
Yeah.
So the illusion itself is sort of dissipating in a way. Yeah, I like that. All right, great. Thank you for this. Let's turn together, because we do have.
a quick solution on the Serenity Prayer authorship.
Yeah, okay. So that's the only reason, because I heard you guys talking about it, and I was the reason why I kind of interjected is because when I was, oh, there goes Jeff, he's left. Like, I'll tell him the answer later. It's sort of one of those academic type stories. So, all right. So let me kind of remind us where we are. We are in chapter 21 of the Gospel of Luke. There are 24 chapters total, so we are getting very close to the end in our travels with Jesus. We are also basically at the very end of the ministry of Jesus. I think it'd be fair to say that for most sort of scholars or whatever, when they're looking at the Gospel of Luke, the end of chapter 20, marks the end of the public ministry of Jesus, even though chapter 21, which I'm going to describe in just a second, is sort of said in public in a sense. It's sort of demarcated, but whatever the case may be, we have kind of come to the end. And I at least have planned, I'm hoping that we'll get to it today, to transition into the last sort of intimate moments, in a sense, that Jesus shares with his disciples, which obviously, of course, includes the institution of the Lord's Supper and the beginning of the Passion narrative. So that being said, I'll jump us in. So this is just really a reminder. I don't have this material a spot on your outline. This is actually some of the material from 2 weeks ago, just to kind of remind us of where we are. So this whole chapter 20, verse 5, all the way up to 38, it all kind of hangs together. It also has parallels in Matthew and Mark, so most of this material shows up there. There are some peculiarities in Luke that I mentioned last time. One of those is that Luke, even though we are in the midst of what is sometimes called the synoptic apocalypse, Luke softens some of the apocalyptic imagery that you will find in Mark and Matthew. And so Luke sort of has a slightly perhaps different angle that he's pursuing on this. One of the other things that I mentioned last time, and I think it's worth repeating, is the placement of this material, right? So if we're finding this same basic set of teachings, if you will, or an apocalyptic vision, if you will, if we find it pretty much in all three of the synoptic gospels, and we find it where it's put. So in other words, why does the public ministry of Jesus end with this? That's what I mean by the conspicuousness. And I think personally, one of the reasons is that Jesus understood that what he was about to enter into in the form of his passion and crucifixion was tantamount to being an apocalypse. It was because it was going to mean the end of his life. It was going to also, though, mean a kind of judgment on the powers of sin and death, which is typically the way that apocalypse and apocalyptic texts that we also discussed last time, they deal with those big questions. What is the end going to look like? What is God's judgment going to be? Will God, and obviously the answer typically is almost always yes. Will God overcome and vanquish the powers that enslave humankind or that are seeking to destroy Israel, et cetera? If you're reading like a traditional apocalypse, those are some of the big questions that show up. And I think in a sense, I'll come back to this, Tom. I think on a certain level, there are a few places in this material, chapter 21, verses 5 through 38, that really does connect in some ways to what Jesus experiences. And in fact, the way that the gospel authors talk about his death, that there's an earthquake, that the sun is blotted out from the sky. These are all like typical things that you would find, phenomenon that you would find in apocalyptic texts. So the way that even the gospel writers understood or thought about the death of Jesus is that it was earth-shaking, right? It was an earth-shaking event. Yeah, go ahead. And use the mic.
Just that from times before in studies, you pointed out apocalypse doesn't mean end times per se, but the revealing.
Right,
And so like the curtains opened up.
exactly. Which is, of course, is another one, right? The rending of the veil in the temple, etc. That's right. That's right. Yes, and so that word apocalypse, apocalyptic, is a word that literally means to reveal, revelation, which is why sometimes people will describe the last book in the New Testament as the Revelation of John, or if you're hanging out, in the South, they call it Revelations. So that's another way that it gets pronounced. But that is legit another way that this word can be translated. In general, the point I tried to make last week was that this is an entire sort of genre of literature, and that apocalypses or apocalyptic texts, they become very important as a text, but also instruments whereby, particularly in Israel, if we're talking about Jewish apocalyptic texts, whereby they're able to process some of the things that they're experiencing. And what I mean by that is, and I actually mentioned this a couple of weeks ago, I was reminded of this during the sermon that I preached, which was, after the exile, the expectation is not only that they're going to be sent back to Israel, but they're going to rebuild the city of Jerusalem, refound the temple, and the Davidic monarchy is going to come back in, and the kingdom of Israel is going to become triumphant. Well, that never happens. That last part never happens. Yes, they rebuild the walls. Yes, they are able to rebuild the temple, but they do not become an independent sovereign power, except for a very brief period of time, about, I don't know, maybe 60 years, up to about 40 years before the birth of Jesus. So that never happens. So what do they find themselves? They find themselves basically living under the thumb of other superpowers. And at that time, some of those superpowers would have, of course, been the Persians, and then eventually the Seleucids, which are the leftover sort of kingdoms that arise after Alexander the Great, and then eventually Rome. Well, what do you do if you're a small community in the face of that kind of onslaught? You have to negotiate that somehow, right? And one way that you negotiate that is through being reminded, I think, that even though things don't look good, even though we're having to make compromises with pagan powers, nevertheless, God is still on the throne, and God is still, the one who's directing history. And so that's oftentimes what these texts really are talking about, apocalyptic texts. You can find a ton of these, and there's quite a bit of diversity. And as I say here, they typically are concerned with impending events. And then I think this is, to me, very important for reading this chapter, and that is that these are highly symbolic texts. So if there's a play, we've tried to do this as we've gone through the Gospel of Luke, where we've said, hey, let's remind ourselves that this is a parable, right? And therefore we can't take everything out of it literally. We need to read it as a metaphor, which is what essentially a parable is. I think the same kind of thing we need to operate with as we're reading through this material, because again, apocalyptic as a genre is a highly symbolic genre. And then I kind of highlight for you basically here the structure. And essentially, there really are three big events that you could say that this material deals with. But that's, I think, the ultimate point, and I'll point this out in just a minute, is actually lies elsewhere. So The first event that we actually did cover last time is through verses 5 through 11, the fall of the temple. And that really is what gets this whole conversation going. If you remember, they're standing in the temple where Jesus has been teaching for weeks while he's been, or for days while he's been in Jerusalem. And someone is remarking on the beauty of the temple. And that begins sort of the discourse. And Jesus talks about the fact that it's going to fall. We're now today going to jump in starting in verse 12. And I personally believe, and I'll make this point as we go through, that these verses 12 through 19, are really at the center of this whole discourse. That's really the most important thing in a certain sense, in terms of what's going on. We then get a return to another sort of historical event, the fall of Jerusalem. And then lastly, some, I don't know, glimpses or sort of patchwork discussion of the final day, right? The days of the Son of Man. So you get a little bit of that in Luke. And in some ways, I suppose some of that stuff is a little bit more prominent in the other versions of this material. So the big question to me is, how do you make sense of what's going on in this text? And I found this to be the case. I think I don't know that I've ever taught through the book of Revelation here in this church, but I did.
We'd remember.
Yeah, that's right. I did teach through the book of Revelation at a different church many, many years ago. And you can so easily get lost, because it's basically like a Hollywood blockbuster. It's got dragons, it's got like beasts, it's got like crazy people who come out of the ocean, And so what do we do with all that? How do we decode that? And so the symbolic element is always at play there. And so it's helpful, I think, as you encounter a text like this, to ask, like, what's really at the center? What's really at the heart of this? Like, why are we encountering this? Is it supposed to be telling us something about the future, about the whatever? And I think it's actually this material here, verses 12 through 19, that should say, rather than 12 through 18. And that is, how do you live in the light of trials? And that really was where my opening question was kind of inspired by that. How do we deal with uncertainty? Because the kind of things that Jesus is about to describe can be just, we can describe it in many ways, but one way I think we have to say is it certainly feels uncertain. But that's kind of a weird way of putting that, but I think that works. Certainly a way of, certainly uncertain. So without kind of delaying much further, let's hop in together. And if I can get a volunteer who's willing to read our first passage.
Can I have one comment?
Yeah, but put the mic up
Okay.
next to you.
And when you were talking about the Davidic kingdom and how that kind of is broken a little bit in kingship and all that, since you're being ruled by other kings and other nations, all the more why Psalm 110 after Jesus's death would come to play, because he's gone to the throne room. And so the Lord said unto my Lord, sit here at my right hand until I make thy enemies thy footstool.
Right.
And so here it is. What do you do in that time between? This is the time God's on the throne and he's yet to put all the enemies under your foot.
Right. And and as you're saying that, it reminds me, I don't know if all of you remember this, and I can't remember if it's chapter 17 or 18, but actually it's at the very end, just before Jesus enters into Jerusalem, I think, where he tells the parable of the local noble, right, who's gonna go to receive his kingdom. And what are the people going to do while he's away, right? And it's the whole story about leaving them a certain amount of talents, so they're going to use it or whatever. That is in some ways the parallel, I think, text. Excuse me. Sorry about that. All right.
Now back to our story.
Yeah, now back to our uninterrupted scheduled session.
But before all this occurs, they will arrest you and persecute you They will hand you over to the synagogues and prisons, and you will be brought before the kings and governors because of my name. This will give you an opportunity to testify. So make up your minds not to be prepared, not to prepare your defense in advance. For I will give you the words and wisdom that none of your opponents will be able to withstand or contradict. You will be betrayed even by parents and brothers, by relatives and friends, and they will put some of you to death, but you will be hated by all because of my name, but not a hair of your head will perish. By your endurance, you will gain your soul.
Okay. All right. So first of all, kind of reiterating what I have kind of been saying for the last few minutes is I think that these verses, again, I apologize, that should be 12 to 19, but these verses connected to some verses that we're going to encounter later, verses 34 through 36. To me, this is the real engine of this chapter, right? In other words, and I think I'm pushing back here on something that doesn't exist necessarily for this group, but there are certain Christian circles where you would read these kind of texts and you would be like, oh my gosh, Russia is going to invade this, and it's going to be Gog and Magog, and we're going to have the great battle of Armageddon. We're going to have like a Tim LaHaye festival in here or something, which I would never allow, number one. But that proclivity to decode the future, right? That sort of is something that I think we all kind of know, or we're familiar with to a certain extent. And so what I'm trying to say is that that's not really what's at stake here. And in fact, Jesus actually seems to me to undermine it, because several places in this chapter, one of which has already happened in the material before what we read today, Jesus undermines the whole idea that you can actually know when the end is. And he's quite explicit about that in those earlier verses. But what you can know, and I think I'll make this point as we go through, you can know two things. There will be trouble. You will have trials. And number two, God will be with you. Those are the two things I think you can take out of this material as the most sort of solid, connecting sort of thing. So this question, how to live in times of crisis, it seems to me is really the sort of the heart of what's going on. And I think the answer, or maybe the reason why this question is being raised, where it's being raised, because remember we noted the conspicuousness of the placement of this material. It doesn't happen earlier in Jesus's ministry. It literally basically is the last thing he says in public. So think about that, like that would be important. And I think there are two reasons. I think there is one reason to me that makes an awful lot of sense, is that what Jesus is about to go through, right? In other words, the immediate context, how are they going to respond in that context? And of course, we know that they stumble actually in the context of Jesus's trial and execution, right? Where all of his disciples essentially abandon him. But we could extend out, when I say immediate context, we can extend that out historically and remind ourselves that the person who wrote this gospel also wrote Acts, right? And what do we see in Acts? People are constantly being arrested, dragged before kings, and made to give an answer. So it's the immediate context of what's about to happen to Jesus and his life, but also sort of that immediate context of the next 30 to 40 years. Remember, which is, of course, by the time Luke pens this gospel, that's kind of where we are. So that's one reason why I think. The second reason I think we can then put ourselves into, because obviously we didn't live back then, so it's a little harder for us to step into that. But it's this point, right? That there's an overall sense that we've gotten throughout the Gospel of Luke, and I think we would get this in almost every gospel, that following after Jesus comes at a cost. And sometimes that cost is quite explicit, and other times it's not quite as explicit. But nevertheless, there's a sensibility that if the one we're following after, the one that we're trying to walk behind, i.e. walk that way, if the fate that he faced is death because of what he stood for and who he was, then it stands to reason that we as his students might have that same thing, right? So that's sort of this bigger kind of question that I think is at play here. All right, so let's turn then into the verses themselves, right? Verses 12 and 13 will start us here. But before all this occurs, so this is before the destruction of the temple, right? They will arrest you and persecute you. They will hand you over to synagogues and prisons, and you will be brought before kings and governors because of my name. This will give you an opportunity to testify. So there's two things at play here, I think, that are kind of interesting in this group, in this text. Number one is in verse 12. As I say here, basically, to me, this sounds like a description of the book of Acts, really, and kind of mirrors to a certain extent what is going to happen to Jesus himself within the next day and a half of the telling of this story of this text in terms of his arrest and execution. The second thing, though, is that I think is interesting, and this is where I would say this is what I mean by the real engine, and that is there's a call here to have a different perspective, right? So that I think you brought this up, Peggy, I believe, right, about that uncertainty actually also offers you an opportunity, right? And I would say verse 12 is pretty scary and pretty certain amount of uncertainty, right? So how do we respond to that? And of course, human beings, all of us being human, we know that fear can have a very profound impact on the way that we act, on how that we comport ourselves, et cetera. And so the encouragement here is not to be afraid, right? Rather to see this as an actual opportunity. Right, and that is an opportunity, of course, to witness, is the way at least it is described here. Why not? Why not freak out? Well, verses 14 and 15 tell us why not, right? Essentially. So make up your minds not to prepare your defense in advance, for I will give you words and a wisdom that none of your opponents will be able to withstand or contradict. Now, obviously, on the one hand, you don't have to make up your mind about what you're going to say, because I'll give you the words to say. Embedded in that is what? In the midst of the worst possible trials, I'll be with you. Right? I mean, that's really the promise, even deeper than just I'll give you words, is I'll be there with you as you go through this. And I think that's, to me, really significant. It also here connects us to probably the most important apocalyptic book in the Hebrew Bible, which is the book of Daniel, right? That's really where apocalyptic as a genre starts in that book. And we have several stories in the book of Daniel, right, where Daniel faces certain death, right? If he doesn't bow down to a certain statue, he's going to be tossed into a furnace, which he is, of course, or maybe it's he and his friends Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, or Daniel himself, right, thrown in with the lions, etc. So it's an interesting sort of illusion, is my point, the same kind of basic dynamic. And the idea is that in the midst of these persecutions, in the midst of these trials that are going to happen to you, whatever they may or may not look like, God is going to be present in the midst of that. Right? That's the promise. I will be with you. And I use this imagery here, that God will be so present, it'll be like God's whispering in your ear. That's the kind of the imagery, it seems to me, that's kind of being conveyed here. That's how close God will be. You will not be alone, even though you may look around and think you are not alone. Then in 16 through 19, right, you will be betrayed, and this is an interesting one, right? You will be betrayed even by parents and brothers, by relatives and friends, and they will put some of you to death. You will be hated by all because of my name, but not a hair of your head will perish. By your endurance, you will gain your souls. Now, I've kind of put all four of these verses together under one heading. In a sense, you could probably break it in half. 16 and 17 go together, and 18 and 19 go together. 16 and 17 replay a basic theme that we've heard in other places in the gospel story, right? Which is that following after Jesus may, create a crisis of loyalties, right? And we've heard that before about leaving behind your possessions, and which we discussed was not just about material realities. It was basically a willingness to step away from all the relationships potentially, right, that gave your life meaning or security in order to follow after this relationship. And so that's sort of the idea here again, right? All these, right, parents, brothers, relatives, friends, all of those key relationships, right? In a sense, your kin potentially could wind up being something that you have to step away from, right? And when I kind of put this up here on the board, it's possible that those relationships would give us the most security will become the most threatening, right? I mean, that's how deep the crisis could be. And then we get verses 18 and 19, which is, no matter how bad it looks, in the end, you will not lose. Now, I think we have to read that very carefully, and we have to realize that in some ways, this is the perspective, I think it's of Psalm 2, right? Which is the Psalm that Jesus cries out, right? He quotes at the beginning. Is it Psalm 2? Is it Psalm 2 or Psalm
22.
22? Thank you. All right. I knew there was a 2 in there. I was like,
Look
is it?
that up on Google, or you could ask Tom.
Well, I kept looking at him and he was kind of puzzling me a little bit. And I was like, I think I might be wrong. Tom might have it. That Psalm, along with Psalm 110, those are the two most important Psalms for the early Christian community. Psalm 22 and Psalm 110. They show up again and again in all of our early Christian texts. And of course, Psalm 22 and Psalm 110 are on the lips of Jesus. I mean, when he's talking about himself, etc. So what's Psalm 22? It's really a psalm for someone undergoing trial, right? I mean, this is basically the quote, my God, why have you forsaken me? That comes out of that psalm. If you read that whole psalm, though, you will see the cry of, not only the cry of dereliction, but also the confidence that God will rescue. And my argument would be that Jesus knew that he was going to have to go through this trial, essentially, face his death, but that did not really ultimately mean his true end, right? That, in other words, there was a kind of resurrection hope built into that. And that is, I think, how I would read verses 18 and 19. Not a hair on your head will perish, by your endurance you will gain your souls. I mean, for goodness sakes, read the book of Acts. I can guarantee you when Paul gets flogged or beaten, he lost some hairs, if he had any. So if we take this too literally, is my point, right? But if we take this as a kind of admonition that your witness will live on, and that's what's at stake in a sense, then I think that's what's being kind of conveyed here. Right? So though you might die, nevertheless, nothing will be lost. And this, to me, I think clearly foreshadows resurrection. And then the last thing that I would include here as an implication is this, right? That being a disciple of Jesus does not mean you're not going to have trouble. In fact, quite the contrary, right? It's sort of, at least that seems to be certainly the perspective of the Gospels, right? You're not going to avoid suffering. Why do bad things happen to good people? All those kind of big questions, which we all sort of wrestle with sometimes from time to time in our lives. We're not guaranteed an avoidance of that. But what we are promised is that as we go through the trials and the suffering and the loss of hair on our head, that God will actually be there present with us. That's really what's being promised here too, right? It's a very basic promise that we find in all kinds of other versions throughout the Bible. All right, let me stop there for a second and see what kind of comments or questions we might have in the room.
So do we know from this that Jesus knew that he would be tortured, and do we know or infer that he knows he will be resurrected? How much does he know about his story? Is this a thing that theologians have? I want to clear that up now. I know
Oh, you want
theologians.
to get some, I want you to clear this up for me, and then you can tell me about the Serenity Prayer after that.
Okay.
I love you, Jeff. That was awesome. Yeah, I mean, this is certainly something that theologians have talked about and debated. I myself get quite nervous about, because typically the argument is, well, Jesus is fully God, right? So of course he knows, and so it becomes these kind of weird, abstract arguments that ultimately don't seem to mean much of anything in the end, right?
Well, hanging on the cross, he says, my God, why did you forsake me?
Right.
Shows a somewhat of a lack of knowledge or confidence.
Well, my sense is that, yeah, or a foreshadowing, because he is quoting from a psalm that at the end believes that God will rescue. And so I think that's so God does in a sense rescue Jesus on the other side of death. Right. I mean, that's sort of I would say in the gospel narratives, certainly in the synoptics, and I think this is probably also the case in John, we have at least 3 predictions of a impending execution by Jesus. Does he know that he's going to necessarily be executed by the use of a cross? I'm not sure, because I feel like then we're trying to get behind the back of the Jesus we're presented in Scripture. And that Jesus does talk about taking up a cross, etc. And so it's just hard to know, really, from my perspective. Yeah.
And the Serenity Prayer, would this be the place to talk about that?
Yeah, sure. Okay, so Serenity Prayer. The only reason that I kind of know about this is I kept running across this prayer when I was doing my graduate work. And it's attributed to, like, I don't know, 5 or 6 different people.
If I Google it here, it's attributed to everybody.
Oh yeah. So the earliest attribution that I found was to a pietist who, from the 18th century, the 1700s, a guy named Friedrich Christoph Ettinger, who was a great preacher and pastor, etc. And he's such an interesting kind of weird dude. That he was the author of it. I do think, though, that one of the reasons why especially it gets attributed to Niebuhr is, I think, and I might be wrong, but I think that Niebuhr is responsible for transmitting that prayer out of the German context into the English context. So I don't think he wrote that prayer, but I do think, he grows up in a German household in the Dakotas, and he probably takes it out of the German tradition and introduces it into the English. But I don't believe that he's actually the author of it. And it might not even be that Ettinger is the author of it.
No,
It might even be older.
To Google, though, he says he thinks he was probably the author of that.
Yeah, he's wrong.
Anyway,
They're wrong.
It's also attributed by some to St. Francis of Assisi. That would go back a ways.
Right. That would be like 400 years before Ettinger.
And I think the thing that has really popularized that, it was picked up by Alcoholics Anonymous as a theme.
Yeah.
And so that's spread far and wide through their network.
Yeah, that's right. And it contains a lot of interesting, right? A lot of wisdom, actually.
Well, and the 3 words are the serenity, the courage to change, and the wisdom to know the difference. So
right.
Serenity, courage, and wisdom are pretty good attributes to have.
That's right. That's right.
You could
And so
you
you
could
want a
tattoo
tattoo of
on
that?
your arm.
Yes, Peggy.
I won't.
But you could. If
All
you
right.
were committed, you would.
All right, well, any other comments or questions on this passage? Hold on for 1 second.
The one thing about following Jesus and having to give up I mean, that continues throughout life. But when you live to be old, you realize that the things perhaps, let's say I gave up, have very little meaning to me now. You know, maybe at the time that was a big deal. You know, do I follow my faith or do I whatever? But they lose all power and they lose all value.
Yeah, and I there's so many interesting things to say, like in response to that, in the sense that like time and age, right, gives us a kind of perspective and wisdom that you just can't have otherwise, other than that you've gone through it and lived and been able to look back. I think that's right, because it is true when things confront us in the moment that it can be overwhelming. And there's also sort of a spirit of that in this passage, right? You're going to be hauled before the authorities, and you might even be betrayed by your most intimate connections in that. That could feel completely, overwhelming, and would be, I think, to a certain extent. But in the midst of that, then is this promise that I'm going to be with you. And here it's so, I think I don't know if it'd be interesting if I didn't get a chance to check the parallels, but it's not, it's a very personal promise. It's not that he says God's going to be with you or the Spirit's going to be with you. It's Jesus literally says, I'm going to be with you. I'm going to give you the words. And if you thought, like I was thinking about this even as we were reading, I didn't make the observation before, but we've just gotten through like an entire series of interactions that Jesus has had with the chief priests and the temple authorities, in which he has shut them down. And so he's literally saying the kind of argumentation that I just displayed before in reference to these authorities, you're going to have the same thing. That's kind of a comforting thing to take away, I suppose, especially if you like to argue.
Oh, Christian. Just
Yeah.
wanna-
Pretty good at arguing with his opponent.
yeah,
That's true. That's true.
but and I was kind of thinking about that same point. Just here it is. I will give you the words and the wisdom. And later it talks about the Spirit giving you the words and the wisdom.
Right.
So kind of crossover there. Yeah.
There's a definite entwining. And I think when we think about the Holy Spirit, one of the ways that we should describe the Spirit is certainly as the Spirit of Jesus, right? That Jesus is somehow present in a palpable and profound way in the midst of, in and through the Spirit.
Yeah. And then we've got passages like, unless I go away, the Spirit can't come.
Right. That's right. That's right. I'm thinking about doing a class, by the way, next fall on the Spirit. So it is on my mind. All right, so let's move ourselves forward. Can I get a volunteer who's willing to read our next?
Right.
I'll read.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. When you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then you know that its desolation has come near. Then those in Judah must flee to the mountains, and those inside the city must leave it, and those out in the country must not enter it. For these are days of vengeance, as a fulfillment of all that is written. Woe to those who are pregnant and to those who are nursing infants in those days. For there will be great distress on the earth and wrath against this people. They will fall by the edge of the sword and be taken away as captives among all nations. And Jerusalem will be trampled on by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled.
Okay.
Wow.
Yeah. Right. All right. So let me kind of make a couple of observations. So obviously, this material in these verses deals with this overarching, scene or event of the fall of Jerusalem. And just so that we're clear, and I kind of have said this before, but I'll just repeat it. The destruction of the temple or its fall and or the fall of Jerusalem. These are not unique. This idea that this is going to happen is not unique to Jesus, right? So this is the kind of a theme that you would find in some other apocalyptic texts. So there's a certain kind of set of expectations here that Jesus is working with that he doesn't just sort of come up with necessarily. Obviously, there are here historical events in mind, and I think it's important for us to be reminded of this. The two important ones that would be especially germane to this passage, one is the year 70, which is the year that the temple is destroyed and Jerusalem is sacked by the Romans. And then in the year 135, which basically concludes what are known as the Jewish Wars, the Jewish-Roman Wars, Jerusalem is pretty much laid waste. And I think 2/3 or more of the population is deported. And so this is really, in a sense, when the diaspora starts. To remind ourselves, right, Luke is probably pinning this gospel in the middle of that period, right? Probably in the 80s, I think is sort of the idea. So the temple, in a sense, that event has already happened, but the complete destruction of Jerusalem has not necessarily happened just yet. So those are just kind of historical notes. And I don't have tons and tons of things to offer in terms of this set of predictions here.
Chris,
One,
what other point? Just that there was a fleeing of the Christians to Pelham
Mhm.
when they did see these things happen.
right, that's right. Particularly after 135. Is it after 70 or 135? I think it's after 70, actually.
Yeah, I think it was at the 70.
Yeah, so if you're familiar with Pella, with the city that's built into the rock, is that called Petra? Why were we calling it Pella? We were calling it after the Iowa window makers. Yeah, it's Petra. Thank you very much.
Okay, they have better marketing.
That's right. That's right. They have really, yeah. It's too bad this is all recorded because now we can't deny it. Here though is so my point earlier where I said there is already, I'm not saying that everyone expects this, but there's already an idea floating around, right, that Jerusalem is going to be judged, that's part of the process that God is sort of overseeing, that the temple is going to be judged in a certain kind of way. But here, what is distinct here is the way that Luke talks about this, about both of these events, right? The end of the city and the end of the temple are not described necessarily as the final event of judgment, which is actually often the way that those events are talked about. Rather, they kind of precede, in a sense, right? It's not so much the end of days for these events as they precede the sort of end of days. This same language, as I've mentioned, you can find contemporaries. Probably the most important one is Josephus. He uses actually this exact same language about fleeing into the hills, etc. It's so similar, in fact, that some argue that Luke may have borrowed some of this description from Josephus. The last thing to note is this phrasing here at the very end in verse 24. And Jerusalem will be trampled on by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. And so there's a couple just points here. Number one is that the fall of Jerusalem, if you were reading some of these other expectations, that would be the final event. That would be the end. That's the end, essentially, and then God comes back. But what we hear here is slightly different. It's not the end, right? It's not, the fall of Jerusalem is not actually the final act. In fact, there's a limited duration, right? It's but one event in a series of events, which will presage or will sort of look towards the final end. What would we take away from this? I think to me, the way that Luke is reconfiguring, excuse me, I gotta sneeze again. Sorry. This is really bad because when it goes into the Sounds much worse on the mic than it actually is. One of the things I think we can take away from this is it's sort of Luke's way of saying bad things are going to happen. And they might even be cataclysmically bad, but that still is not the final end. And as you go through these really bad things, again, God is going to be with you, right? That's sort of, it seems to me to be the underlying point, right? And of course, no matter, and this is something that my wife's grandpa Orley used to love to say, which is, this too will pass, right? And there's a certain kind of wisdom in that here, right? The times of the Gentiles, they're not going to basically, that's not an unending time. It's a time with a certain duration on it. So even though it's terrible, it's not going to be terrible forever, I think is what you could take away from that. Let me stop for a second and see if there's any comments or questions. You want to pass the mic?
Well, I'm just thinking, they see this as the end of the world, maybe, or the destruction of the world, but it's really only the end of Jerusalem. There's a great big world out there that they don't even know about,
Right.
you know, there's people in China living, you know, and so their view of the world is constrained to what they know, which is a pretty small part of the total.
That's right. And I think even the way that this is now being framed is leaning more in that direction, that this is just that, yes, this is the end potentially of the temple and of Jerusalem, but that's not the end, right? There's going to be more to come in that regard. And so again, it sort of, I think it kind of undermines that proclivity I talked about before, which is sort of the Tim LaHaye left behind, like we're going to use this as a roadmap to figure out, you know, this, that, and the other, which I think is actually an inherently problematic and even dangerous way of approaching these texts.
But Paul is also at the same time is around has gone throughout all the way to each language. There's all sorts of groups all over now that are Christians that think this going back and telling.
Sure.
So
Yeah.
they know already that it's not.
Right. That's right. And depending again on when this is actually written down, right, and what's the setting that Luke is trying to address, et cetera. I mean, I feel like pretty certain that this has to be post temple destruction, but it probably is not. We're probably not up into the 130s or something like that.
Like writing about World War II from our perspective,
Right.
knowing that it worked out okay.
Yeah.
How bad it was.
Right.
Worked out okay.
That's right. That's right. All right, let me move us forward then. Can I get a volunteer who's willing to?
Yep, yep.
Jeff, you got the mic there?
I got the mic there. I got the horse right here. His name is Paul Revere. That's a different song.
Right on.
There will be signs in the sun. Is that where you want me to?
Yep.
There will be signs in the sun, the moon. You got your little covered there. There will be signs in the sun, the moon, and the stars, and on earth distress among nations confused by the roaring of the sea and waves. People will faint from fear and foreboding of what is coming upon the world, for the power of the heavens will be shaken. Then they will see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory. Now, when these things begin to take place, stand up and raise your heads, because your redemption is drawing near. Then he told them a parable. Look at the fig tree and all the trees. As soon as they sprout leaves, you can see for yourselves and know that summer is already near. So also, when you see these things taking place, you know that the kingdom of God is near. Truly, I tell you, this generation will not pass away until all things have taken place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away.
Okay. All right, so let's make a couple of comments. The first is, so we've talked about the temple, we've talked about Jerusalem. Now we're entering into sort of the last kind of area that's sort of discreetly distinct from those other two, which is this is the section that comes a little closer to the end, I suppose we could say. And as I've got it listed up here, it's the days of the Son of Man, right? Because of that was a sort of traditional way of talking about it. And of course, obviously, Jesus here references the Son of Man. So our transition in verses 5 through 28 moves us into sort of the final sort of sign. But in a way that I think is kind of unique. And I don't know if I don't think I have it here, but I will try and draw this out a little bit. The first thing though, let me just kind of read this first paragraph. There will be signs in the sun, the moon, and the stars, and on earth distress among nations, confused by the roaring of the sea and the waves. People will faint from fear and foreboding of what is coming upon the world, for the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Then they will see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory. Now, when these things begin to take place, stand up and raise your heads, because your redemption is drawing near. All right, so first of all, obviously this occurs in the context of a certain set of verses, but I just want to kind of point out this Son of Man language, right? It's pretty conspicuous here, right, in the midst of, and one of the reasons for that is that this is Jesus's favorite title, and he's talked about himself throughout the Gospels by appropriating this image. And within Jewish eschatology, and this is what I mean by this, is Jewish hopes about the end or expectations about the end. That's what eschatology refers to, especially if they're drawing on the book of Daniel, which is where this image comes from, Daniel chapter 7. When the Son of Man appears, well, that's basically the end, because what the Son of Man represents is the final judgment of God, right? And that's the way that he's described in Daniel chapter 7. He's brought into the scene when the books are opened, and he's given a place to sit next to Yahweh, the Ancient of Days. So the Son of Man then is a figure who's associated, as I say, with God's final judgment and with the overthrow of the powers that enslave humankind, basically. And those powers can be actual historical powers, or they can be sort of spiritual powers, like the power of sin. As I referred to earlier, right, this is Jesus's favorite title, and I would argue, and I don't have time to kind of go into a great elaboration here, and I'm not going to do that, but I would basically argue that he understood what was going to happen in his own death was something like judgment, right? That this, in a sense, also was an appearing of the Son of Man, and so something profound is happening over against the power of sin and death on the cross. All right. So if we got aside from that big, right, theme that is overshadowing the whole of these verses, the theme of the Son of Man, verses 25 through 26, one observation here is something that I mentioned, actually, I think maybe last week or the week before, I can't remember, but that is this entwining of nature and the cosmos and the social history or social reality. So in the ancient world, and what I mean by that is, in the ancient world, if an earthquake happened, it wasn't just because, the tectonic plates kind of were moving. It was actually a sign of something. So if something bad happens in nature, it's typically a sign that something bad is going on in the political or social life of a community. So it could be a famine, it could be, a tornado. I don't think they don't suffer from hurricanes in the Mediterranean basin. It could be an earthquake. All those things had multiple levels of meaning, right? They weren't just natural phenomenon. They also spoke about other things. So we basically get that kind of assumption here, right? Signs in the sun, the moon, the stars, and the earth, right? Distress among nations, confused by the roaring of the sea and the waves. Now, that's not just nature. That could also be the symbolic value of what the sea represents in Scripture, which is the sea is basically a symbol of chaos. It's an inhuman space. Human beings cannot live there. And so oftentimes the sea kind of comes off in a negative light. And this is why you have these passages that talk about, when God's glory finally comes, the seas themselves will disappear. Well, that's the vision. That's kind of what they're saying symbolically, is that the source of evil sort of will be gone. All right. So what can we say here in light of that? In light of the picture that's being painted in verses 25 and 26, everything that should be stable, that should be reliable, right? i.e. the rising and setting of the sun, that should be pretty stable. That is not going to be, that itself is going to become unstable. So talk about uncertainty, right? And in that situation, what can one do? The implication, of course, is to trust, essentially, right? That in God's mercy, that's really the only hope. Then we get verses 27 and 28, as I've already mentioned, in verse 27, in particular, in reference to the Son of Man. This is a direct allusion to Daniel chapter 7 and the event of final judgment. When the Son of Man appears, that means that the end, that things are kind of finally coming to their conclusion. But and I think here, the consolation is that when people imagine the end, what would probably be the number one emotion? Fear, exactly. That's what you said, right? Yeah, it would be fear. And what does Jesus say instead? Right. I mean, he says, when these things begin to take place, stand up and raise your heads, because your redemption is drawing near. So again, that having that different perspective in the midst of uncertainty is sort of that same theme coming through in these verses, right? Rather than the final judgment being a moment of fear, it's actually good news, essentially, because God is now going to right all things that are wrong. God's kingdom is about to fully and truly appear, in a sense. All right. The second paragraph in our section here is essentially in the form of a parable, right? And I'll just kind of read this again. Then he told them a parable. Look at the fig tree and all the trees. As soon as they sprout leaves, you can see for yourselves and know that summer is already near. Right. And I think I see Peggy looking outside, checking out the trees to see the leaves. So also, when you see these things taking place, you know that the kingdom of God is near. Truly, I tell you, this generation will not pass away until all things have taken place. Heaven and earth will not pass away, but my words, heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. I'm going to break these verses in half, and we'll jump in starting in verse 29 in just a second. There is a premise, though, here, and that premise is essentially, I would say, found in verse 28, right, which is that the day of the Lord is not a day to be feared. It is a day of joy, essentially. It is a day to be welcomed, because it is it is the final day, right? The opening of the books, the setting of all things that are wrong, and to making them right. Well, if you are a farmer, if you grow up in an agricultural society, which of course would be the case here. I know we're not quite as connected, though probably there are some folks in here who love gardening, right? When you see the plants, right, beginning to show green buds, and right, that's something to be welcomed, isn't it? Typically, yeah. So that's kind of that's the premise, right? That this is not something to be afraid of, rather it's something to be welcomed. And of course, the fig tree is even a more maybe apt, because it's not just that the leaves are turning, and finally summer is coming, which is the way I feel about it living in Minnesota. It's that there's going to be fruit. Like, it's something that will actually nourish you, right? That's the kind of good news sensibility that we get. So in verses 29 through 31, we get the image of the fig tree, right? And essentially trees tell us, right? They bear certain signs that give us an indication that fruit is about to come. And in the same manner, Jesus is saying that all of these, what feel like dreadful signs, because of this instability, the sun, moon, et cetera, it depends on how you're going to look at it. You could look at it as a dreadful, terrible thing, or you could look at it slightly differently. And we've already heard that. Remember, going all the way back into our earlier verses, which essentially troubles are going to happen, but you can look at them as troubles, or you can look at them as an opportunity, or maybe you can look at them as both. I don't know. But if we were going to kind of spin this out a little bit further, I suppose we would go that direction. But as I mentioned here, all these dreadful signs then are indications not of final doom and destruction, but rather of God's coming liberation, essentially. And then we get what I think are more perplexing, a couple more perplexing comments at the very end, starting in verse 32 and 33. Truly, I tell you, this generation will not pass away until all things have taken place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. You know, if Jesus had just stopped at verse 31, that would have been fine. But then you throw these in, and they're kind of enigmatic. All right. And so, as I mentioned here, and basically what I'm reflecting to you is not only our own, like, what do we do with this, but the fact that it's been that way, like it's that way in the scholarship as well. So what are some different options? One option that I thought was kind of interesting is that the word here, and I didn't get a chance to check my lexicon, but the word for generation here can refer very definitely to a set period of time, i.e., Jesus could literally be saying your contemporaries are, not gonna, none of this is gonna pass away for the next 30 years, which I suppose would make some sense, I guess, but not a lot. Or generation can refer to something like an era. And I think that's if you decide to go in this direction, and I think we have to go in this direction to a certain extent, I think the second option to me is a better option and actually fits within an apocalyptic framework. And what I mean by that is that if you read these apocalyptic texts, they will talk about the two ages, the old age and the new age. And I think this could be read as something like that he's kind of talking about that this is an age, right, in a sense, and we're still kind of living in that. The other option, which I think also should be included, is that some of the signs that Jesus has described, something like those signs actually appear at his death, right? I mean, so there are signs in the sky, right? There are signs on the earth. There's an earthquake. There's a rending of the veil. There's a Gentile who exclaims that Jesus is king, that must be the Son of God. These are all things that would have been expected in Jewish anticipations of the end. So Jesus could actually be saying that within the next 2 days, many of these things are going to happen, right? And that, and so we can kind of build on that and take it, I suppose, in different kinds of directions. Look at that. Right on time. Can you believe that?
Bingo.
I had a lot of extra, I have more material to go, but let me stop for a second though and see what kind of thoughts, comments, questions folks may have. I unshared my screen. So let's start in the room. We have the mic. Jeff, you got the mic?
Who needs the mic here? We have no questions from the audience.
Oh, wow. All right. Or I just wasn't clear. I was like, I had enough academic gobbledygook that you.
But I'll just ask one thing. I mean, there are several things in scripture, I take it in the Gospels, where Jesus says this generation will not pass before such and such a thing will happen. And they have passed. I mean, he seemed to keep making that allusion over and over about several things that created an immediacy. Didn't the people right after he died, they thought he's coming back soon. And they lived in that expectation, but then it didn't happen.
Yeah, and so there's another set of verses that we're not going to obviously deal with them today, but when you get up into the Lord's Supper scene, where Jesus is sort of instituting the supper, at least that's the way we interpret it. He says something like, I will not taste of the fruit of the vine, until I come in my kingdom. Well, interestingly enough, in the Gospel of Luke, what does Jesus do with the disciples? Like there's several scenes where he basically is eating with them. And so I think one thing you could say is that Jesus actually does come back. It just is not the final coming back. And so I tend to think there's kind of it's a mashup here of expectations about his final coming back, but that's connected also to his initial coming back, which is what essentially a resurrection is, right? It's some kind of coming back. Comments or thoughts from folks online?
I just had a quick thought. The confusion in these verses of trying to figure out the generation or the era. Maybe the reason for it is to just keep us trusting. We don't need all the answers. I personally don't need all those answers. And if we're going to live one day at a time, tomorrow takes care of itself.
Yeah, I like that. There's a little anecdote, an anecdote about Martin Luther that I really like, which is Luther. I think he talks about this in his table talk, and he says something like, "If someone came and told me that the Messiah had come back, I would say, well, that's great, and I would go and plant a tree. First thing I would do is plant a tree." And the point is, I think the point that Luther kind of gets at, number one, is like when the Lord really does come back, like everyone's going to see it. Number one. Number two, he was probably talking to people who were, and there were a lot of people at Luther's time that thought that the Lord was about to come back, because like the Reformation was viewed as that kind of a social upheaval. It had to be the end of days. And Luther's argument was like, this too will pass. If the Lord comes back, he's going to come back. And if he doesn't, I'm going to plant a tree. And because what does it mean when you plant a tree? You're investing for the long term. It's not just a seasonal, thing that you're planting a tree. It's going to take a while for it to grow. Go ahead, Peggy.
I think every generation or every era presents the possibility of this is it. And I remember having some construction work done at our house. They were putting on a different roof thing, and there was two young men that were doing it, and they were in a very fundamental church. And they were talking about, boy, they're, pretty soon they're not going to have to repair that or worry about their money because Jesus is coming back.
Yeah, and I mean, in the 1840s, there is I think it's the 1840s. It's either 1830s or 1840s. There was a conviction in Germany that was so certain that Jesus was coming back that, in fact, in the Black Forest, there were people who were building clocks that would stop working on a certain day at a certain time in 1838 or something like that. There were people who abandoned their businesses, sold their farms. Some of them immigrated to North America because they thought that was where the kingdom of God was going to show up. And so there have been,
there was verbiage of that with the pandemic.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Or now with, the war in Ukraine and Russia, and yeah. Okay, I think we're at our concluding time, and I apologize for going over a couple minutes. Could I maybe would you mind closing us in prayer?
Oh, dear Lord, thank you for this time, for your teaching, for Christians teaching, for each other. Dear Lord, we will keep in mind those among us who are no longer here, and Help us, dear Father, to do your will in this coming week. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
Amen. Thank you. Thanks, everybody who's online. Good to see